My husband and I just watched a new Netflix documentary that just came out called The Greatest Night in Pop. Of the innumerable musical happenings that could be, depending on your frame of reference, I'll give you more than just a hint. We are the world. We are the children. So yes, the documentary is about the recording of the song We Are the World. The legendary producer Quincy Jones, with Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson, who wrote the song, gathered some 40 of the biggest names in music at that time, and they came together overnight on one night after the American Music Awards in 1984 to produce a record to raise millions of dollars for humanitarian aid for the famine in Africa. That's my era, so I could go down a rabbit hole of how incredible it was and how excited we were when that song came out. But that's not what I'm doing right now, even though I'm going to say a bunch of big names. Bob Dylan, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Willie Nelson, Bruce Springsteen, Steve Perry, Cyndi Lauper, Paul Simon, Tina Turner, Ray Charles, Smokey Robinson, Harry Belafonte. Even if pop music isn't your genre, you've probably heard of many of these recording artists. And what stands out about them in this instance is that they had all come to this session without their managers, without their assistants, without any entourage, just themselves, each one very famous, usually the most fawned over person in any room they were in, now just being themselves. And guess what? They were all awed by being in the room with the other people. Diana Ross asked Daryl Hall for his autograph. That would be like Desmond Tutu asking me for my autograph. The iconic folk singer-songwriter Bob Dylan was there. He's a little bit of an awkward guy, and he was so nervous because pop music isn't really his genre, and he wasn't used to recording in a crowd anyway. His nervousness was calmed by singing alone at the piano with Stevie Wonder, who pretty much gave Dylan a kind of line reading for his solo in a Dylan-esque voice. I'm telling you, Stevie just shined with joy that eased Bob Dylan, nervous Bob Dylan, into breaking into the most beautiful smile that really shined. Diana Ross cried when it was over because she didn't want them to leave. And she shined. They all shined just being themselves, without their outfits, without their entourages, just being themselves and being seen as just themselves, but still being dazzled in each other's company, shining their singular gifts. We are the world, remember? Now, my point is, it's not that these famous people weren't already known of to each other, but they weren't known to each other as their real, authentic selves as they were on this long, arduous night. And they shined brighter in each other's eyes than they ever had. I mean, Peter and James and John, they already knew Jesus pretty well, right? They already thought he was a big star. They had already seen him do some incredible things. They knew that they had a potential game changer on their hands in this era of Roman occupation and oppression. They had seen and they had heard, and they knew all kinds of things and more. But on this mountain today, this day that we call the Transfiguration, Jesus literally shined in their eyes. But had Jesus actually changed? Had Jesus become someone else, someone better? Or did Peter and James and John just finally get to see him better, see him for his full self, see him beyond their assumptions? was a change in their perception, not in Jesus. They knew Jesus was special. In the preceding chapters in Mark, they've been on the road with him, and he has done wonders. Peter has even presciently declared, "You are the Messiah," before today's reading. And Jesus will tell them he must undergo great suffering and die and rise. And Peter says, "No." So there's still this veil over their eyes of what they're imagining, of their agenda for Jesus. And so today, Mark's gospel says they went high up on a mountain, the place in ancient scripture considered to be close to God. And Jesus has taken just 3 of them. That probably felt special and portentous and maybe a little ominous too. They're probably hot and tired right now. And then it happens. Jesus is transfigured before their eyes, and Mark tells us they were terrified. And so do Luke, and so do Matthew. All 3 of the synoptic gospels give this account of Jesus shining, and Elijah and Moses appearing, and of the cloud and of the voice, and of the terror. What's going on here? They're not in any danger, actually, but their world has just been changed. They're not seeing Jesus through the veil of their own preconceptions or their own projections now, or through their own ordinary narrow vision. The veil has been lifted, and they're seeing Jesus shine for real. They're seeing him for himself in all his fullness. And when that veil lifts, we can see more. And that can shake us to our core. I mean it in our lives, too. Something out of the ordinary can happen that breaks into our quotidian world and shakes things up. And I don't mean bad things. Good things do this. Stevie Wonder's joy and Bob Dylan's smile do this. Our own moments that we have, a feeling overtaken by God's goodness and a fleeting sense of the nearness of the deep holy, do this. The scholar, Reverend Ian Paul, says, this sense of the transcendent erupting into the mundane is an important reality of the Christian faith. Yeah, it is. Christians know that we live in the presence of the transcendent, but in our human way, and not as a criticism, but as our actual selves, we're used to wearing the veil. But somehow, sometimes it lifts for us, like it did on the mountain for Peter and James and John, and we recognize that Jesus is, the holy is, that God's self is brightly beautiful and right there in front of and within us. It lifts sometimes when we seek it, but more times when we aren't even looking. But we can be keeping half an eye peeled for it too. Jesus wasn't suddenly something new on that mountain, but the disciples suddenly saw who he really is, God's self, and they were shaken. Are we shaken when we encounter the reality of Jesus? When we encounter scripture that is countercultural? Words of Jesus that challenge us in the way that we live and the priorities we swim in? If thinking about Jesus as he really is, or thinking about Jesus maybe differently, or even at all, if that doesn't rattle your world, it should. And it should, yes, in good, transcendent ways, where I want to pitch a few tents and stay with the encounter of the holy instead of my ordinary. But it should also rattle when I'm faced with someone I disagree with and I'm getting agitated at them. And then I need to remind myself that this person is God's beloved child, as Jesus said and showed me. And that changes my perception. I follow a rabbi who sends out an email, and this week his email said, did you ever notice that how much a person annoys you goes along with how much you like them? The more you like them, the less they annoy you. So if someone's really annoying you, maybe your job is to like them more. Our perception. Our perception has to change, right? But that realization is the transcendent erupting into the mundane, as much as the dazzle and as much as the still small voice. And when I can see that and the person before me hasn't changed and become shinier, I know it's my perception that has needed to change. And maybe it does. The disciples were awed when they suddenly can see Jesus shining as he really is. The journey for us is to see everyone that way. And if I can see them that way, maybe I can treat them that way. Because they didn't stay up there on the mountain, right? Jesus trekked back down the mountain from the Transfiguration to be engaged with the people who needed him in the hard places of life. But the shining would not be forgotten. And Jesus brought his disciples down with him. They were newly enlightened to engage in the same way. That is the practical implication of our being transformed by our encounter with Christ. That is being a Christian. God's self is beyond our description. The glorified Christ looked shinier to the eye than the one trudging down to his death in Jerusalem when he comes down from that mountain. But this is the same glorified Jesus who didn't choose to stay up there just shining. Jesus is down here where people need him. Our faith is glorious. And some days, with moments I hold on to, little tiny moments between big, long nothings, it can feel glorious. And we can encounter that glory. But just like the disciples on the mountain who are going to face the very difficult road ahead in Jerusalem with Jesus, we're going to face things that shake our faith. And we need to hold on to our faith, to the glimpse of the reality of the glorious that we've had in special moments. Peter and James and John, they won't see it again until the resurrection. But us? We're an Easter people. We already know he is risen. We're moving into Lent this week, and our preparation is not for Jesus' death, but for Jesus' resurrection. Yes, Lent is a solemn time, a traditional time of penance, but even more so, it's a time of mindfulness. Mindfulness on those days when we're just trudging down the mountain, that we don't forget what happened on the mountain, and that we remember and see with more open eyes to live like we're an Easter people. Because wherever we trudge, Jesus is there. And there are people who need us to be Jesus' hands and feet and voices, and even to shine. And you may think, well, I can't heal or help anyone. I can't even handle my own mess. And you know what? God doesn't buy it. Listen to him, the holy, mighty voice says, right? Listen to him and drop your preconceptions and projections of who God is somehow supposed to be and see the fullness so you can trudge back down and do what Jesus has said. This is my beloved Son. listen to him. That's what our call is as Christians. Listen to him as we enter this holy season of Lent. Listen with intention. Listen with more attention than we usually do. It will be Lent where we recognize how we're still here in the valley, needing and heeding the reminder to see Jesus as he is and to listen. We can do it because we are an Easter people, and we too have seen his glory.